Hello everyone, and welcome to this assessment briefing video on the BSS044-3 first assessment. So this is for the International Business Management Unit. It is going to be a bit of a lengthy video, but I strongly encourage everyone to watch it all the way through. We are going to cover pretty much everything that you'll need to know to understand the assessment, as well as to get started on working on the assessment. So we're going to cover 5 distinct areas. So we're going to look at the assessment task itself in detail. We're going to cover some of the relevant unit concepts and theories, although there will be lots of units and theories that you could use. Looking at what sources of information can be used for the assessment itself, a suggested structure, not one that you should definitely use. It depends on your argument and what kind of recommendation you have and how you want to argue for it, but there is an outlined recommended structure that you could base your own structure off. And then lastly, looking at the mark scheme itself. But before we do that, we're just going to take a look at the top of the assessment brief. The assessment brief is available in the assessment and feedback folder on the Brio shells. And there are just a few things I want to point out. Firstly, the weighting of this assessment is 40%. It is a written report. And because this is a 30 credit unit at level 6, it is going to be 3,000 words, so it is a long, complex report. It is not the kind of report that you can start working on a few days before the deadline. It is one that's going to require quite a bit more effort and more planning in order to do well and get a high grade in. Regarding the word count, it is 3,000 words. That is the usual plus or minus 10% that's in place across the university. So the maximum word count is therefore 3,300 words. Anything over that, and the university policy is to stop marking. So if you're significantly over the word count, then unfortunately you do run the risk of losing marks, because we won't be able to take into account anything over that 3,300 point. That is not the total word count of the document. However, there are quite a lot of exclusions to that word count. So it's excluding your executive summary, your reference list, title page, table of contents, and any appendices if you have any appendices. So really it's just from your introduction all the way through to your conclusion. So if we get started with the first of our 5 sections about the assessment task itself. So if we again look at the assessment brief, you are being asked to apply your understanding of international business, market selection and entry modes to a specific organization. You must evaluate the organization's current international strategy and recommend a new market to enter, along with the optimal entry mode to use in entering that market, and any other relevant information that you deem important. So there's 2 things I really do want to highlight. Number 1, when you're asked to apply your understanding to a specific organization, this is not one that you are just choosing at any point during the unit. It is going to be allocated to you by the unit coordinator, which is myself. Now, depending on which location you're studying at, and whether you're studying at various campuses or with our various partners, the exact process may be different. If you're not sure, then please do ask your tutor, whoever's directly teaching you, and you can always email me as well. But for various reasons, including originality concerns and also making sure that everyone has an organization that's appropriate to the assessment and that you can get a good mark using, we are going to insist that either allocation or confirmation is required by the unit coordinator. If you choose to ignore this and just go ahead and choose a company, and every year we get a few students who decide to just choose a company a few days before the assessment is due, so a few days before the deadline, you're not going to get your report marked. You would have failed to have followed the requirements of the assessment brief, and that will be an automatic fail. So please make sure you keep that in mind. Start working on this early, and make sure you understand which company you should be looking at. The other element I just wanted to highlight is the any other relevant information you deem important is really important. It's really critical to getting a good mark for this particular assessment. So you're going to be writing a formal business report recommending a new national market and a new entry mode to use, but that could encompass a huge range of different concepts and theories and ideas, depending on your recommendation. If you're recommending a market with lots of cultural distance, your report may have a lot of research and a lot of consideration of cultural factors. It may have a lot of consideration of micro-environmental factors, or looking at competitive rivalry. If you're entering into a highly competitive market with lots of existing competitors, depending on the country, the new national market you've chosen, it may have a lot of consideration of political factors. So there is really a huge amount that you could be including. What you choose to include really should reflect and support the strength of your recommendations. So it really is a unique report in this regard. That is not something you can just take a basic template and fill in some details which are specific to your organization or your company and call it a day. You really do have to think through the implications of your recommendation and what kind of concepts and models that you need to include in order to have a strong, well-supported, well-reasoned argument to really support your recommendation of a new national market and an entry mode to use. If we look further down in the assessment brief, we also have a section which highlights the absolute minimum of what needs to be included within your report, and that is an evaluation of the current international strategy of the organization. So if you're recommending a new country to enter, then you can't really do this without also including an evaluation of what the current international position, the current international operation, and the current international strategy of your company actually is. So that's a really important baseline to include in your report. Your recommendation for a new country to enter won't make a huge amount of sense unless you have that baseline understanding of what the current international operations of your organization are. Then a justified recommendation for a suitable new national market to enter with evidence and reasoning, as well as a justified recommendation for a suitable entry mode to use, again with evidence and reasoning. A little bit further down in the assessment brief, I just want to draw your attention to this paragraph where it's asking you to demonstrate both your theoretical knowledge of the necessary theories, frameworks and tools, as well as consideration of the practical issues and potential obstacles. So this is not a purely theoretical or heavily theory-based assessment. You're not going to be just talking about major theories in the abstract. We're expecting you to apply them to the specific scenario, i.e. the actual company you've been given, in order to demonstrate your knowledge. So you need to combine both. You need to apply the theoretical models and the frameworks, but we really do want to have real practical consideration of real issues, of real international trends, of real globalization processes. All of these things absolutely should be included as well. So hopefully that's an explanation of what the task is. So fundamentally, you're writing a report in order to recommend a new country to enter for a specific company, as well as an entry mode to use. So that's really the baseline task. You're writing a report that typically you would write internally. So you can imagine you're working for that particular company, and they're considering expanding into a new country, a new national market, and you'll be writing a report in order to recommend a new national market to enter using a suitable entry mode. So if we move on and look at the second major area that we're going to cover, which is what unit concepts and theories are relevant to this assessment and what should you actually use. Now, some of these are very much necessary, others are potentially helpful depending on the country you've chosen to recommend to enter and the company that you're dealing with. So you should not treat this this kind of next couple of slides as an exhaustive list. If we have covered another concept or theory which you think is relevant and useful to your particular argument, then absolutely you can include it. So with that said, if we start, well, the first, one of the areas that you should be tackling, and probably the first major area you should be tackling in your main body, is evaluating the current international strategy of your organization. And we cover this into the international, I think it's called the internationalization strategies video in week 3, and we also have a discussion on international, how globalization affects international businesses in the exploration of globalization in week 1, where there's also a lecture video. So that's covered in both week 3 and week 1, but you're particularly going to want to evaluate which of the 3 international strategies that we present in the week 3 video in particular. The next major area would be, again, looking at the minimum requirements, would be an application and discussion of country selection methods as well as entry modes. And these are both covered in quite a bit of detail in week 4. So we cover entry modes in quite a bit of detail, and you have a video detailing each individual entry mode as well as highlighting strengths and weaknesses of each. So you need to make sure you choose an appropriate entry mode for your company and the country you're recommending. We also have another video which goes through some of the major methods for country selection, as well as the concept of scanning, which should be really quite key to how you're approaching the assessment as a whole. So all of that is in the week 4 folders. I do just want to highlight one additional thing as well, which is how you should be approaching entry modes as a concept. We don't just want you to apply entry modes in the abstract or without really consideration of the country that you're entering or you're recommending entry to. So if you look at the individual entry modes, they do mention about the impact they have on the competitive market, whether they're adding capacity, whether they're taking over an individual company that's already present within the competitive landscape. So you do need to consider micro environmental factors. So we're talking about the micro external environment. So think about things like Porter's rather than Pestel, which is macro environmental factors. So we do want a real practical look at entry modes. You're not just abstractly choosing an entry mode at random. You're considering entering into a real country, into a real existing competitive landscape. So that needs to be considered as well. Since we mentioned macro environmental factors, this is another major area, and we have covered this in quite some detail already in weeks 2 and 3. So we look at political systems and political risks in week 2. So you may want to consider the political system of the country that you're recommending, and you may wish to evaluate the different political risks. And that is in the week 2 folder, and there's 2 separate videos on this. As well as this, we have a video on legal systems, which is in the week 2 folder as well. And you may wish to consider the legal system of the country you're recommending. As well as this, the other major macro environmental trend, as well as the obvious economic stuff, is going to be culture. So we've got videos and activities in week 3. So we cover both cultural distance. So you may be looking at something like Hofstede or Trompenas for cultural distance, as well as a general consideration of the cultural difference within the new country and any relevant cultural factors. Further topics that could very much be relevant and useful to your argument would be an evaluation of operational and trade factors. Now we look at the global supply chain in week 7. So absolutely a good place to start when understanding how international supply chains function and how your new country that you're recommending would fit into your organization's existing supply chain. You may, and I would strongly recommend this actually, looking at trade barriers and regional economic integration, and we covered that in week 8. So the country you're recommending to enter, so what are the trade policies, what are the trade barriers for the products or services that your company is selling, and therefore what kind of either advantage or disadvantage would you have with other competitors within that country. The chances are that the country you recommend is going to have a different currency to the home market of your organization. So looking at currency exchange and forex or foreign exchange markets would also be a useful thing to support your recommendation as a whole. And then lastly, we also want to look at potential ethical considerations or potential ethical issues. So in week 5, we cover ethics in international business, and we look at major ethical frameworks and concepts and theories that may well be helpful in you discussing and evaluating potential ethical considerations. For international businesses, procedural risk and corruption is always extremely important. So we actually have a distinct week laid out for this. So this is going to be in week 6, where we look at forex, but also corruption as a major area of study, as well as linking this to procedural risk, which is one of our 4 political risks that we look at in week 2. So that gives you a range of relevant concepts, theories, and models that we look at during the unit. But again, like I said, there may be others that we cover that are uniquely relevant or helpful to your particular company and your particular recommendation. You may have other kind of structural kind of considerations or word length considerations, so you need to make a judgment call on both the order and the structure and the number of relevant areas, concepts and theories that you include. Remember that this is ultimately an argument. You are writing a report recommending and arguing that your company should enter a particular new national market, a new country, using a particular entry mode. So you should imagine speaking to senior managers or decision makers at this company and think, what would be convincing, what areas would I need to cover in order to make this a viable possibility. So your choice of concepts and theories and the way that you arrange them really does have a big impact on how convincing your argument and ultimately your recommendations really are. So if we move on to the next major area we're going to look at, which is what kind of information or what sources of information should I use, with the obvious question of how many citations should I include, which is always asked, and the answer is always going to be the same. Well, quality matters over quantity. If you have tons and tons of citations, but they're all poor quality or not appropriate for where you're citing them in the report, then you're going to get a poor grade. But if you look at the type of report this is, I would expect a reasonable range of high quality citations. You are looking at a lot of different concepts and theories, a lot of different academic areas, as well as getting information about a huge range of real world issues as well. So we do want lots of high quality information in the report, and we can split this into two sections: academic and non-academic citations. We do need both of them. So for the academic citations, they should support your concepts or your discussion of key concepts, theories, and models. So if you mention things like scanning, you talk about different entry modes, you use OLI or Uppsala, you talk about cultural distance using Hofstede. All of these things should be supported through academic citations. You've got the key text, you've got the core textbook, but also you've got a ton of academic literature available through the library and the library website as well. So there should be lots of high quality academic citations every time you apply or you invoke a IB concept, theory, or model. Alongside of this, you obviously want lots of high quality citations supporting the actual discussion of your organization as well as the country or countries under consideration. And this is where you want non-academic citations, because you're citing information drawn from the real world, so about the actual country you're dealing with, the actual globalization processes, actual trade barriers and trade policies. So these should be drawn from non-academic areas, so outside of the academic literature, but they should still very much be credible. Now, websites are obviously the obvious place to go, but I have to be quite clear here. Any of these websites or websites like these are not credible and they are not appropriate. So dictionary.com is just a bit silly when you've got access to all of these high quality academic literature that you're using dictionary.com to define key terms at level 6, your final year of your undergraduate degrees. That shouldn't be done. Sites like businessball.com are really not credible and not reasonable websites to cite either. It doesn't show much research ability. Investopedia very much falls under the same bracket. Wikipedia is a bit of a different case. I think Wikipedia is an amazing social project. It's wonderful, open source, distributed collection of knowledge, but it is a wiki. Which means that we simply don't know who edits which areas. It's ever changing. It's not fixed. It doesn't have specific people attached to it. Anonymous edits are very, very common, as well as certain areas are fiercely contested. So just try and go on the wiki page for any kind of international conflict or controversial areas, and you'll see edit wars. So it isn't appropriate because of the structure of Wikipedia itself precludes the kind of certainty that we need at this level of university. So any of these are not credible websites. Please do not use them. It really is not something that you should be doing at level 6 anyway, but now at least you've been explicitly asked to avoid these. Instead, we do have legitimately credible websites and plenty of them that you can use. So Harvard Business Review, theconversation.com are two good sources. Neither of them are peer-reviewed literature. You will have to access Harvard Business Review through the university Discover portal because it's behind a paywall, and we don't want you guys to actually pay for access. You have access paid for through the university, but it is not peer reviewed, therefore it isn't considered to be an academic publication. It is, however, a very credible high quality publication. Theconversation.com is very similar. You'll find lots of fantastic articles on here written by very credible academics, but this is not peer reviewed as a avenue for academics to get their knowledge and their research out to the public without having to go through journals and the peer review process. So again, it's not an academic source, but it is a very high quality source. If you want particular information about GDP, population, segmentation, any of these stats and figures to support your recommendation, which you absolutely should have, don't just Google population of, Romania or population of Egypt. You've got high quality stats. The World Bank, the UN, and the IMF all have major data banks available to the public. So that would be, again, an impressive, credible citation, as well as just the usual other stuff, the Guardian, the BBC, other credible news sites. And if you are using Wikipedia to understand a particular topic or concept, you cannot reference Wikipedia, but you can go down to the bottom of Wikipedia articles, and you will often see citations from other sources, and those can be followed. And if you think those are credible, i.e. they're not coming from the Daily Mail or somewhere, then you absolutely can reference those as well. So if we move on to the fourth area, which is what structure should you use, I really have to flash up a big warning sign here that this is really just a suggested structure. It's one that may work for some of you. For others, you may think, well, actually, the argument that I want to make would benefit from being structured in a different way. In that case, that's absolutely fine for you to use your own structure. You have to make sure that your structure is appropriate for your argument. That's part of what you're being marked on. So consider this just to be a suggestion to get you thinking about how you might want to structure your actual report. So if we lay out the structure and go through it one by one. So at the beginning, as ever, you have a title page. You do need at minimum your student ID number, as well as the unit code, which is BSS044-3, and the assessment number. This is assessment 1. So that's what you need on your title page at minimum. Your second page should be the executive summary. Now this is the it has to be a proper executive summary, which means you're looking at about 2 paragraphs or half a page maximum. It falls outside the word count, but we need to follow the conventions of an executive summary, which means if your executive summary is a page long, no one's going to read it. So we need to make sure it's short enough to act as a summary. The purpose of an executive summary is to allow the reader to judge whether they need to read the report or not. So that means you need to do 2 major things. What is the purpose or the premise of the report? And then what is the major findings or recommendations of the report? So you should not be writing an executive summary that's written like a trailer. Like, if you read this report, I will look at this, then I will look at that, and then I will make recommendations. That doesn't help me decide if your report is relevant to what I'm doing at this moment and whether I need to read it. So you need to be upfront and clear. The premise of this report is to recommend a new national market to enter and an entry mode to use by company X. We will look at A, B, and C. My recommended new market to enter is, I don't know, Egypt or China, and the entry mode is acquisition or FDI. So you want to get everything up front and clear in the executive summary. The next page is table of contents. This might sound really obvious, but you do need to format this as a formal business report. So you need page numbers, sections should be numbered, and there should be subsections, should also have point numbering, and then you need a proper table of contents with all of your sections and subsections listed, as well as the page numbers listed as well. Please do use the if you're using Word, Microsoft Word, to write your report, you have some really good built-in tools, so you'll have to learn how to format things as headings and subheadings, and then you can automatically generate a really nice looking table of contents. If you're using LibreOffice or I can't remember the name of Apple's equivalent program, you've got similar tools in there as well. You just need to figure out how to use those tools. That's a valuable professional skill. It's something that you'll want to learn going into professional work, and it does make your reports and formal documents look far more professional and far more presentable. Now we move on to essentially the start of your report proper. You have your introduction. Now, as with any introduction, you need to do a couple of things. You need to expand on exactly the purpose of your report and what you're trying to achieve. You need to give any necessary contextual or background information that the reader may need, and this includes defining any key terms. If you're going to repeatedly use particular acronyms, then they should be spelled out and stated as well. If the reader needs to understand something critical in order to understand the rest of the report, that should be explained as well in the introduction. And then lastly, you want to give a brief overview of how the rest of your report is going to be structured. So 3 things: explain that, expand on the actual premise and the purpose of your report, what you're going to do. Secondly, you need to give any necessary contextual or background information. And then thirdly, you need to give a brief overview of the structure of the rest of your report. And then we can move on to section A. And then remember, this is just a recommended or suggested, not even recommended, just a suggested structure. But one of the first things you really would want to do when you're giving a recommendation to a company for a new market to enter or a new country to enter is firstly kind of spell out exactly what the current global operations are, what the current international strategy is, so you have a context for your recommendations. So you don't really want to be talking about entering this country or that country without establishing what the current configuration of your company's global operations are, as well as the current international strategy that they're using. So that would be the first thing very much to do, and then that allows us to move on to a suggestion for section B, which would be a discussion of country selection methods. So if you're going to be using the OLI method, this would be the place to discuss it. If you want to adopt Uppsala, this would again be the place to discuss it. The rest of certainly you want to be invoking the concept of scanning to highlight what the most important aspects of a new market for your company should be. So again, this would be the place to establish all of those key variables and key factors for your recommendation. So what we've done then is to establish what the current configuration of the global operations are. We've talked about what key country selection methods and principles we're going to be using, and by using the concept of scanning, we're highlighting what we think the most important variables, the most important factors in a new country to enter are. And then that allows us to move on and start actually discussing some of those key factors or key variables. So a suggestion would be to perhaps put the next section as an evaluation of your macro environmental trends. So this is the macro external environment, things like politics, legal factors, cultural differences, social trends, environmental trends. All of these things would ideally be grouped together in a single section, as they are all macro environmental trends. Like I say, you may want to take your structure in a different way. You may think, actually, for my recommendation, I really need to speak a lot about political trends. So maybe you'd break political trends into his own section, or vice, or the same if you think that cultural trends are really, really important. So again, there is flexibility there. But if in the absence of any of those considerations, you may want to group your macro environmental trends together. Then you can go on and perhaps have a discussion about the operational and trade factors. So these would be some of the more practical aspects of international business. So looking at international supply chains, looking at the relevant trade barriers or trade policies, any regional integration efforts, anything like that may be relevant or support your argument as well. I keep saying support your argument. Remember, if there's anything in any of the information that you gathered which would argue against your recommendation, please don't ignore it. You do need to deal with it, but you need to either explain how it's not as important as these other factors, or perhaps is a more complex situation than just saying that this is a negative factor. Once you've done that, I'd recommend moving on, or I'd suggest moving on to discuss any possible ethical issues which may need to be considered or highlighted. And that should go into detail, possibly identifying one or two major ethical issues, and then again you can use all of the ethical frameworks and theories as well before you move on to your final discussion and justification of your entry mode to actually enter your recommended country. And then with this, that should really have a conclusion to your argument. You should have gone through both the baseline existing operations, your justification for your country selection, going through macro environmental trends, operational trade factors. You should have taken a look at any possible ethical issues in operating in your recommended market, as well as a thorough justification of a particular entry mode to use. Then what you need to do then in your next section, your conclusion, is to essentially highlight the key points of your argument, to summarize and then conclude your report. Remember that your reference list is not included in the word count, and if you need to use any appendices, they should also be excluded from your total word count. There are a couple of potential uses for appendices here. So if you've relied upon any major reports that are central or key to your argument, then you can extract the relevant sections and include them as Appendix A, Appendix B. But what you should not be using your appendices to do is to get around the word count by placing anything which is a major section of your report, or which it forms part of your or forms a major part of your argument, and place it as a separate appendix. So anything which is key to your argument or key to the flow of your argument, that should all be the within your main body. The appendices are only for supporting documentation, for supporting documents. So your word count in total is from your introduction through to your conclusion. Your title page, exec summary, table of contents, reference list, and appendices are all excluded from your word count. So we're just going to go now and take a brief look at the mark scheme. So the mark scheme itself has 4 separate sections. So knowledge and understanding, research quality, structure and discussion, and presentation and referencing. In total, so the first 3, knowledge and understanding, research quality, structure and discussion, are all equally weighed at 30% apiece, and then you have 10% for your presentation and referencing itself. It's worth pointing out that there is no requirements in terms of presentation beyond it must be a formal business report, and it must have a professional presentation. So you can use any font you like, and the size and so on aren't specified, as long as it's something which looks reasonably professional, something that you would not be embarrassed to hand in to your manager in a workplace. That's absolutely fine. With referencing, at this stage, this is the last semester of your 3rd year at university, so we do expect a full, proper Harvard UOB referencing. I just want to take a quick look at the first class column on the mark scheme for each of these sections. So for knowledge and understanding, we have very good use of academic literature, excellent overall application of multiple course concepts, models and theories. So as we have said before, you do at minimum need to include a discussion of the internationalization strategy. So you need to identify which international strategy your organization is using. You need to have a discussion of entry modes, and you need to have a discussion of country selection concepts. However, that's just the minimum. You should be bringing in things like political risks, things like cultural distance, things like economic integration, trade barriers, tariffs. All of these multiple course concepts are really needed. So sit down and consider exactly what you would need in order to convince someone of your recommendation, and that should provide you a guide of what kind of course concepts, models and theories you should be including. And you should see at the bottom there as well, it is a mention of multiple entry modes discussed with accuracy. So when it comes to your final section where you're justifying your use of entry mode, that should be done in the context of the other entry modes there. So if you choose to recommend FDI, there should be at least some consideration of acquisitions as an alternative entry mode, or perhaps joint ventures. If you recommend, say, going in as a franchise, then you should have a consideration of licensing and exporting as alternative entry mode. So you do want to consider more than just one entry mode. The next section being research quality. Well, there should be a really high quality range of research here, so we don't just want academic citations. The report is dealing with a real organization, a real company, and you'll be recommending a real country, a real national market to enter. So we want a lot of high quality non-academic research as well. And remember to go back to those list of sources that we discussed. Structure and discussion will be the next section. We have highlighted and kind of mentioned several times that the way you structure your assessment really feeds into the strength of your argument. So do consider the structure carefully, both sections and subsections, to make sure that you do have a good flow of ideas, that it is a convincing argument, not just in the individual points that you make, but also the order of points and how those points link to each other. And lastly, you have your presentation of referencing, so a formal report structure. Remember that there is report guidance on the LR web, as well as accurate referencing, and that you don't miss any citations that you've used in text or have anything in the reference list which wasn't cited in the text.